Thank you for joining us for our 2020 Virtual Outdoor Education Field Day. Our first presenter is Judy Wright. Judy is a senior agriculture resource educator from Cornell Cooperative Extension of Seneca County. And Judy has almost 40 years of experience working with agricultural and environmental audiences, mostly within the Cornell Cooperative Extension system. Judy will be speaking today about pollinators, and thanks for joining us, Judy.
Oh, thanks for giving me this opportunity. I am really excited to talk about pollinators because right now pollinators are starting to become very active. Still a little chilly out, so I'm not outside today, but I do want to talk about pollinators. And to start off with, I wanted you to think maybe for a minute, well, maybe not that long, just think about what your favorite flower might be. So keeping that in mind, let's then think a little bit about what is the purpose of a flower in the life of a plant. And if you came up with the reason that plants generally produce a flower is to reproduce the plant by producing a seed. And that's actually carried out by a pollinator, some type of pollinator coming in, visiting that flower, gathering some pollen along the way, and then going off to visit another flower and then pollinating that flower, and eventually we get a seed from that. So when that happens and the seed is formed, the seed then is planted and it grows a new plant. But what's interesting is not all flowers are pollinated in the same way. And actually flowers have developed over time very specialized parts, shapes, colors, scents, and other types of characteristics to bring in their specific pollinator. So how are plants or flowers actually pollinated, and what are some different types of pollinators? My guess is that you've probably already thought of a honeybee, which is probably the one that's best known, but there are many other types of pollinators available. Animals can act as pollinators, birds can act as pollinators, and even insects can spread pollen from one flower to the next. So let's think about a few pollinators that we might be seeing in the next few days to a couple weeks as our plants start to flower, start to shed pollen, and later this summer into fall will start to produce seed. So I apologize if you were actually with me at Outdoor Education Field Day, we'd be handing these out and talking a little bit more about these, but I hope you can all see that what I'm holding up now is a picture of a honeybee. And honeybees, like I said, are really probably the ones that most everybody thinks about. And they are very critical, as are a number of different bee species. The honeybees are not the only pollinators of the bee species. There's hundreds of them around. So really, honeybees don't really see red, but they do like flashy colors on plants that attracts them in. And a lot of times the flowers themselves will have a pattern on their leaves. We won't see them because our eyes aren't as acute as the honeybees are. But if you were to take an ultraviolet light outside and shine it on the flower, you might actually see the pollen and the patterns that attracts the honeybee into that specific flower. Also, it's not shown on this picture, but the honeybee, when they collect pollen, will actually start to pile it up on their legs, as will other bees, and you'll see big pollen balls that are collected there that the bee then takes back to the hive and uses for that. So based on what I just described, they like kind of bright, flashy flowers. Doesn't have to be red. We're going to look at this flower here. And this is a bluish flower. It has a lot of petals. If you were able to see it up close, you could actually start to see some of the patterns that are attractive to honeybees, and the honeybee comes in, lands on it, and goes into the center of the flower where the pollen's going to be that they collect it and then take it back with them on their legs. So has anybody along the way thought of another type of pollinator? A lot of people like them. They're coming here now. That would be the hummingbird. Hummingbirds actually overwinter in much warmer climates. They're starting to come back now. We usually see the hummingbirds in my backyard about now because the forsythia is in bloom. And while the hummingbirds are really attracted to red flowers, they will go to any type of flower that has a long tubular flower to it. The one we just looked at for the honeybee has a little bit of that, but it's a more flat type of flower. So the hummingbird will go generally to red flowers, as I said, and this is a good example of one. This is a red flower. You might be able to pick out the long tubular part. And what they do is they put their long tongues. They have very long tongues that go down into the tubular part of this or the throat of the flower to get the nectar. And along the way, they collect pollen. When they take the pollen from this flower and go visit another one, even on the same plant, they then deposit that pollen right there. So that's another type of pollinator, which is a bird versus the insect part of the bee. Another insect that is very good at pollinating, we don't think much about it, are actually butterflies. Butterflies and moths are very good pollinators and actually have become quite specialized with the type of plant and flower they work with. So here we see the butterfly on a flower and it's collecting pollen. They generally like the bright colored flowers because it brings them in. And they too have a long tongue that actually comes out and acts like a straw to help sip up nectar that the flower is producing. And again, like the hummingbirds along the way, they're collecting pollen to take to the next flower. So the flower that I just wanted to show you that butterflies might go to tend to be pretty yellow. They're very flashy. They like a lot of bright color and they kind of stand out a little bit. So when you see butterflies, think of them as not only pretty and fun to watch, but the fact that they are also part of our pollinator family. There's one last pollinator that I wanted to talk about and mention. While there's many more, these are the ones that are probably most specific to our area of central New York. And this is not an animal, it's not an insect, it's nothing we've talked about yet. It's actually the wind. And the wind is very helpful in pollinating some types of plants. The one that I wanted to show in particular is a little hard to see. This is actually like a birch tree, and the birch tree will start to produce these long seed pods. Now they're not flowers. They're not going to be attractive to butterflies and hummingbirds. Honeybee or other type of bee may go to it to gather pollen, but it may not. So how this type of plant really functions to be pollinated is with the wind blowing. So you can imagine these are long seed pods, they're very thin, and when the wind blows, the pollen blows off and goes from one plant to another. There's also a crop that our farmers grow a lot here in central New York that you might be thinking about that the wind also helps pollinate. I'll give you a second to think about that. And if you came up with corn, whether it be field corn that farmers use to harvest for grain or to feed to their cows, or our sweet corn that we like to eat later this year, the heads come up and out and they're called the tassels. That's the last part of the plant. And then they open up and shed pollen. And the wind helps to blow the pollen down onto what become the ears, which then have put the silk out. And of course, the silk's what we get caught on our teeth when we eat the sweet corn. But it's very important for that pollen to come from the tassel at the top of the corn plant and shed with the help of the wind down onto the silk so that we can enjoy a full ear of sweet corn. So now we've talked a lot about some of the different pollinators that are there. Let's do a quick review and think about why we consider pollinators to be important and how we can help to protect them. Again, the wind's going to blow. That's a function of nature. But Pollinators are important, and in particular, we have to be very careful what we do out in the environment. We want to be careful of using any type of insecticide sprays that may harm the pollinators as they're coming, like the honeybees, even sometimes birds. If they get a full dose of some different insecticide sprays, they can become harmed as well. We also want to be aware of what we're doing on the ground. There are ground nesting bees, like bumblebees, that require the ground in order to build their nests in. Not all bee species build nests or hives. So these saving ground available for ground nesting bees like the bumblebees is very important. And another thing, if you're really interested, that you might want to consider doing, now's not too early to think about it, is to start a butterfly or pollinator garden at your home to work through this spring into summer and see how many pollinators you can actually attract into your yard. So Nate, thank you. That's kind of the conclusion of my presentation. And I'm happy to answer any questions you or people watching this might have. People are welcome to email me through Cornell Cooperative Extension of Seneca County, and I will definitely get back to them.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Judy. This is great. I never knew that hummingbirds had long tongues. I guess, just assumed that they used their beak. But that's super interesting. I'm wondering, you mentioned that there are ways that we can help pollinators at home, and you specifically mentioned a pollinator garden. Are there things that you might recommend planting in that garden specific to pollinators?
Sure, there's a lot of different species of plants that you can add. So we don't have enough time for me to list them all off, but I would say generally most plants that you would enjoy growing and seeing will act as that. There are some specific seed mixtures out there at the local garden centers. You can find them almost anywhere that say that they are a pollinator garden. And so those would be worthwhile doing. But even if you don't have a yard to plant stuff in, you can even put out different types of hanging baskets. Mother's Day is coming. Sometimes moms get baskets. And I actually find that a hanging basket of fuchsia, which is a type of flowering plant, will not only bring in the bees, but also the hummingbirds can't resist them.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. And we'll definitely share your contact information with everybody. And we hope to see you again at next year's Outdoor Education Field Day, hopefully in person.
Yeah, I'd like to do it in person. It's much more fun, but I hope this was fun for everybody to think about and kind of play along with me.
Well, thank you so much.
My pleasure.